so pleased to see so many of you coming out here this evening. And I'm just going to introduce myself real briefly. I'm Doretta Sobolewski. I'm the Director of Research here at the Frontier Culture Museum. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you and introduce our speaker here in a second. But just a couple of notes. There will be a book sale of Professor Smithers' book after the talk. Copies are $20, cash only. And I would also absolutely love for you to fill out a attendee survey. We have paper copies over there, and we also have QR codes. You can just scan that with your camera on your phone and complete it. It's just 5 quick questions. And I also want to welcome everyone who's watching online today or is watching the recording after the fact. So if you're in the area, please come see us here in person at the Frontier Culture Museum. And without further ado, I'm going to take a look at my notes here, so make sure I get everything right. So Gregory D. Smithers is a professor of American history at Virginia Commonwealth University and currently holds a British Academy Global Professor. He received his PhD in history from the University of California, Davis, and is taught in California, Hawaii, Scotland, and Ohio. Specializing in Native American history, Smithers' work also explores the intersecting histories of race, gender, and sexuality. And this year, the Association of American Publishers Awards for Professional and Scholarly Excellence have recognized Dr. Smithers' book, Reclaiming Two Spirits, Sexuality, Spiritual Renewal, and Sovereignty in Native America, and awarded it the prestigious Prose Award in Cultural Anthropology and Sociology for its significant advancement in the field. So, congratulations, that's exciting. And without further ado, I turn it over to you, Professor.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming out tonight and sharing a little bit of your evening with me. It's an honor to be back. I was here 2015 to talk about another book, which seems like a lifetime ago now. So it's lovely to be back in the barn. So, Two-Spirit history. Let me get started here and begin by providing everyone with some sort of brief background about language, where we get this terminology from, what it means, and where it might be going in the future. Because in many ways, the history and culture of Two-Spirit people is something of an intellectual frontier for many in the Two-Spirit community. Two-Spirit is not an end, it's really a beginning of something else and something new and revitalizing throughout Indian country. So the term Two-Spirit, let me begin with that. It is an Ojibwe term and the Ojibwe are an Algonquin-speaking people. And as many of us know here in Virginia, there are many Algonquin-speaking peoples in this part of the world. The term that the Ojibwe used for Two-Spirit people was Nij-Manitowoc. That was the term that was agreed upon, and I might flip back and forth here just to make this point. Well, no, I won't, because that'll just take me through the slides. But Nij-Manitowoc was the term that was translated into English in 1990 just outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba. A group of activists and social organizers, academics, Indigenous people who called themselves gay and lesbian at the time. Queer was not really a term at that time, the late 80s and early 90s. Mid-90s it was starting to turn. Queer was not then a term that people used and adopted. It was an epithet at the time. So gay and lesbian Indians, they got together just outside of Winnipeg. This was the 3rd annual gay and lesbian gathering. The first 2 took place in Minneapolis and one just outside of Denver. And so they got together in Winnipeg, and the issue that they were discussing the issues I should say they were discussing were manifold. Remember, this is 1990. 1990, we have an AIDS pandemic that is out of control in many communities of color and indeed in many communities throughout North America and other parts of the world. And it was proving very difficult for Indigenous social organizers and activists to get any attention from tribal leaders to take this issue seriously, the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And so 1990 was seen as something of a very important crossroads to deal with this problem of visibility. In many ways, it's still a problem. But 1990 was particularly acute because people were dying. So over several days, people camped out. They talked, they sang, they laughed, they shared stories, and they cried. And by the end of it, it was agreed that they had truly made history at this campground just outside of Winnipeg in Manitoba, because they had decided that this ancient term, Nij Manitowoc, translated into English would be their new term to address what Richard LaFortune referred to as the problem of naming, Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit then is an umbrella term, born out of a moment of crisis, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and designed to raise visibility for people who have gender fluid and sexually fluid identities throughout Indian country. Colonialism had done a number on many of these communities and all but erased traditions that were multiple millennia in the making in many cases. So the umbrella term then addressed this issue of raising awareness about HIV/AIDS and getting care to people who were living with AIDS. What it also provided was a sense of community, which can't be understated in the context of the late 80s and early 1990s. Homophobia was not just an issue in white America and black America. It was very much a part of Native America as well. A number of the people I interviewed for the book referred to the types of slurs that they were regularly exposed to within their Indigenous communities. Terms like queer, terms like bottom, were used to refer to people who now proudly call themselves Two-Spirit. And so in that sense, in this moment, Two-Spirit as an umbrella term was designed to be a verb rather than a noun. It was designed to be something that would change over time, like Native traditions themselves. It would be a dynamic term that would provide people with the language, the sense of community to help them go back into their own respective sovereign tribal communities and to begin to reclaim the traditions associated with gender fluidity and sexual identity within their respective corners of Indian country. And so in that sense, when people came out of the Winnipeg gathering in 1990 and told journalists that we've made history, they truly have, or had. They changed the discourse, not only in LGBTQ plus politics, but in Indigenous history and culture and the way we understand Indigenous history and culture. And this was something that was Native-led. This can't be understated, and I talk in great length about this in the book. What people have been recovering over the last generation and a half now are these identities, these roles within their respective community, and expressing them and claiming them very publicly in a way that wasn't possible in the 1970s and the 1980s. The Dene have some of the most sophisticated and well-developed gender identities and gender roles within Indian country. The most popular and famous being the Naglehi, the one who changes. The Lakota people have a tradition involving the Winkte. Cheyenne, the Hamane. And the Cherokee have a number of words. In fact, the Cherokee have approximately 13 or 14 words to describe different gender roles and identities that people can take on in their respective communities. So very different from the type of history and culture that Europeans brought with them to North America after 1492. And I want to turn just briefly to that history, because that history of Europeans trying to figure out what was going on in Native communities and to change what was going on in Native communities speaks very much to what happened in some of the discussions that took place in 1990 and continue to be ongoing today. So, first, let me take you back to 1515. This is what is represented on the screen here. This is a wood carving of Vasco Núñez de Balboa's conquistadors, Spanish conquistadors, attacking a community of Quava people in the Isthmus of Panama. This was, for all intents and purposes, a genocidal attack on the Quava people. Now, what happens here in the Isthmus of Panama in 1515? And I should say, and we can talk more about this perhaps after I get my students to talk about this, this image is so utterly chilling. And I think it, as a primary source for understanding the type of historical trauma that sort of resonates through Two-Spirit conversations and through Two-Spirit communities, this explains an awful lot. So what had Balboa and his conquistadors, though, what had they seen to, in their minds, warrant this type of violence? Well, according to a number of the scribes who traveled with Balboa's conquistadors, they had seen, quote, sodomites among the Quava. Now, I don't have time to go into the nuances of both how Catholics saw sodomites and how emerging European legal traditions understood the category of sodomite. Suffice it to say, it's complex. It's not as we might understand sodomy today. A sodomite in the early modern period in Europe could be someone who not only had anal intercourse with another man, but anal intercourse with their wife, intimate relations with an animal. A lot of people convicted of intimate contact with farm animals in early America. Gives another sort of picture of what the frontier was like in many communities. Sodomy could come under very broad categories of things like masturbation as well. Right? So sodomy was a very broad legal and religious cudgel with which to try and control human beings, to bring order and control to a society. Something that was seen as lacking in Native America. Right? And many of you may be aware of a lot of the stories and stereotypes that come out of the early centuries of colonization that talk about the freedom and the natural liberty that Native people had in the eyes of European artists and writers and politicians. That was a problem. That wasn't a good thing for the architects of settler colonialism, and certainly not for the conquistadors. Right, so there's, in other words, a complex legal, cultural, and religious set of rationales for why this type of violence might be justified. The logic at the end of the day, though, boils down to this. Balboa and his conquistadors wanted to destroy people that they identified as sodomite, or sodomites. They were engaging in an explicit act of genocide involving not only early modern firearms, but as you can see, Spanish mastiffs, dogs. They too were a technology of colonial conquest in the Americas and throughout the American borderlands and frontiers. This incident involving the conquistadors and the quote-unquote sodomites, is something that is continues to resonate in Two-Spirit oral traditions and conversations when they think about things like missing and murdered Indigenous women and trans people as well within Native communities, particularly trans women. In other words, here, this was a very violent history. If you had a fluid gender identity or engaged in sexual activity that colonizers like Balboa deemed as outside of Christian norms, then you really did open yourself up in the eyes of Europeans to some very violent retribution. These were sins beyond the pale. What's important to keep in mind here is it's not just sodomites who proved to be problematic in the eyes of European colonizers throughout the frontiers and borderlands of the Americas. Several other categories also appear in the sources from the 16th century through into the mid and in some cases late 20th century. Sodomite is obviously one. The other is hermaphrodite, which was often used as a catch-all, as I explained in the book, to persecute people who were just seen as deeply problematic, that seemed to change their identity and their physical appearance. Some of us here, the way we're wearing our hair, we would have got into some serious trouble in the minds of Spanish and early English colonizers for trying to manipulate our quote-unquote true nature. We might have been seen as, indeed, hermaphrodites if we were part of Indigenous communities. In fact, I'm left-handed, so I would have been considered an ambidexter and probably burned at the stake. So hermaphrodite's another term here. The other term that I want to bring to your attention is badash, and I'll flash up an image of how this term endures in a moment. Badash clung to the history of gender fluidity and sexual identity in Indian country for some time, well into, in some cases, the early 2000s. In fact, I was at a history conference. I was just telling a friend back in 2003 or 4, and I was listening to a paper at a conference, and there were still historians using the term badash in 2003-4. This was long after 1990, when Two-Spirit was emerging and beginning to circulate. The badash, just to get you situated here, has its etymological roots in ancient Arabic. It referred or refers to a catamite, or a boy kept for homosexual purposes. And it was often used in early modern Europe and throughout the American colonies to designate a male prostitute. All of these labels poison the written archival record of settler colonialism. They are, as I've argued, a form of archival silencing, and what some scholars have referred to as a type of paper genocide, sort of obfuscating and eliminating the full depth of the human identities that Native people had within their respective communities. And this is something that runs through and is well established by the time we get to the 19th century and then into the early 20th century. As I mentioned, scholars continue to use the term badash well into the late 20th and some into the early 21st century. But in the 19th century, when artists like George Catlin were representing Americans across the Great Plains, he encountered examples of people we don't identify today as Two-Spirit, and he was deeply disturbed and offended by what he saw. In his words, and I talk about this in the book, Kaplan said of the Badash custom, as he called it, "I wish that it would be extinguished before it is more fully recorded." Right? I think this raises all sorts of questions about the nature of the colonial written archive, sources, how we understand the past, and how we mediate the different types of sources to give meaning to people's lives on their own terms, but then to give some meaning to that history for us, looking back and looking forward. Because history is, as we're all probably aware, not just an academic exercise. It's something that is used to ground people's identities, and, if you pay attention to the news, to shape politics and what we think about political decision-making and decision-makers. Okay, those are the colonizers. I'm sick of talking about them for now. Let's move on to something more positive, and the joy that existed within Native communities in spite of colonialism. And I want to talk briefly about the person that you see on the screen. This is a person that the French and the English refer to as woman chief. This is Biawatchichesh, an incredible human being born around 1806. A member of the Gros Ventre community. There were many women and men like Biawatchichesh across the Great Plains, Northern Plains, and into the Pacific Northwest in the 18th and 19th century. Fur traders, their diaries are littered with references to people whose gender identities are just not fixed, and it really just blows their minds that they can't get a read on these people and who they really are. Their authentic nature, right? It keeps coming back to that again and again. So Biawatchichesh was known as a woman who dressed as a man. Early in life, it seems that Biawatchichesh demonstrated extraordinary skill for marksmanship. And seeing this, as often happened, the elders within the Gros Ventre community, as in other Native communities for that matter, decided that this young person had particular skills and a role to play within their community to bring balance and flow to their community. And so they should be nurtured in this skill that the fur traders and other Europeans associated with masculine pursuits, right? Being able to hunt and trap and fight. Biawatchichesh could beat their butts, it was often reported. However, as often happened across the Northern Plains, Native people were engaged in some positioning and posturing of their own during the 18th and 19th century, right? These are polities that are in flux, and that flux is in part driven by the existence of and pressure from outside forces. So I mentioned fur traders, but also expanding colonial powers as well. Right? And if we think about the northern Great Plains up into the Pacific Northwest, all the way up to Alaska, and down the Pacific coast in California, there's a lot of imperial powers vying for that vast domain. Right? You got Russians, you got the British, eventually you got the Americans, you got the Spanish, who am I missing? Did I say the French? You got those guys as well. Right? A lot of people out there vying for dominance of this region. At the same time, there are pre-existing political, economic, and social rivalries that Native polities have been engaging in for an awful long time. And in some cases, the emergence of these outside forces exacerbates or magnifies those tensions. So, it seems then that during her young adult life, Biawatchichesh got caught up in these tensions and was taken captive by a group of Crow warriors. Crow didn't have a great reputation among other native people throughout the American West for much of the 18th and into the 19th century. They were seen as people who would make an alliance with pretty much anyone, if it benefited them, right? The ultimate opportunists. That being said, and I think this is revealing, the Crow encouraged Okitcitakwe in her gender fluid identity. Indeed, they encouraged Woman Chief to continue to hone their skill as a marksperson and warrior. Okitcitakwe continued to wear men's clothes and indeed was identified by the Crow as a man. Ultimately, though, Okitcitakwe's life ended prematurely in 1858, killed in battle when the Crow engaged their longtime enemies, the Blackfeet, who themselves have a long tradition of gender fluidity. So, Okitcitakwe is but one example of someone who took on a very prominent role across tribal boundaries. And I mention them because in the context of colonialism, it would be highly unusual for someone like Woman Chief to be taken captive by, say, the French or the Russians or the English, and to retain their fluid gender identity. But that continues to hold, despite all of the tensions that might exist between Indigenous polities. Well into the 19th century, it seems that these traditions continue to be cultivated across tribal boundaries. And I should point out that today, there's anywhere between 150 and 200 federally recognized tribal nations that have these traditions, these surviving traditions of gender and sexual fluidity. It's not been easy for them to survive. As Clyde Hall, who I interviewed for the book, said, because of the violence and the so-called paper genocide of the archives that people like George Kaplan there on the screen perpetrated against Native people, a lot of traditions went severely underground. Right? And that was a strategic decision on the part of Native people to try and preserve and hold on to stories, narratives, knowledge on their own terms. Now then, I mentioned this term badash, and I wanted to fast forward and then pause on this term for a little bit because it's really important to wrap our heads around why this is important and why it was so monumental that Two-Spirit people adopted this term in 1990, the term Two-Spirit, that is. So badash, this is a piece from a social science journal, scholarly journal from the 1950s, 54, 5, or 6, around that period. A lot of interest in sexuality during the 1950s, right? A lot of you might have studied the social history and cultural history of the United States in the Cold War, right? The 1950s, early 1960s. Red Scare, there was also a Lavender Scare. People were very disturbed and concerned about the possibility of, quote unquote, the gays in the State Department. There was concern among academics that mainly psychiatrists and anthropologists that there was something degenerate, pathological, just wrong with people in Native communities who took on fluid gender identities or indeed embraced a homosexual lifestyle. And this is what you see here with this type of article. These are fairly common and they filter into the newspapers of Cold War America. And it's important for a number of reasons. One is it naturalizes this sense that there's something off about Indian country, that Americans have failed in their sense of reforming responsibility and duty to change Native people, to bring them into the Republic, to assimilate them. And so there was this renewed effort, this intent, and I'd underline the word intent, to go into Native communities and to study those who were aberrant, engaged in malignant practices, had something wrong with them. Right? And we're talking here about psychiatrists, psychologists, anthropologists in particular, social scientists. Their work naturalized this hostility towards people we know today as Two-Spirit. Right, so as much as Balboa and those centuries of violence had an impact on the way Native people understand their history in relation to settler colonialism, so too does academia have some answers, have some questions to answer for their role to play. And this occurred, the intent to try and understand the pathology and what was wrong with the homosexual Indian. This occurred from roughly the 1860s and 70s through to the end of the 20th century, right? And so that's within living memory of a lot of people who lived then with a lot of trauma. But things begin to change in the late 60s and early 70s. This is Randy Burns, and this is Barbara Cameron. Barbara Cameron in particular is particularly important to the story I tell in Reclaiming Two-Spirits. She was a Hunkpapa Lakota, grew up on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, died sadly much too young from cancer, complications from cancer at the end of the 1990s. In fact, I think this picture might have been taken shortly before she passed. But Cameron was a force of nature, as was Randy Burns. And Randy Burns is still alive and still a force of nature, I should say. But they got together in San Francisco in the early 1970s. Now, let me set the context for you briefly here. I mentioned that a lot of Americans, white Americans in government, in missionary work, felt like they were failing the quote-unquote Indian in the Cold War. Right? They weren't assimilating. What's going on here? We've tried the boarding schools. Right? We all know how well that went. Didn't go well at all. Why don't we engage in a policy of termination and what some Native people refer to as a sort of second trail of tears? Right? So in the 1950s, the policy of the Eisenhower administration was to terminate tribal sovereignty for those tribes who survived the Dawes era, the late 19th, first decade of the 20th century, and then to provide programs that would disperse Native people to urban areas and suburban areas throughout the United States in the latter half of the 20th century so they might seamlessly, quote-unquote, assimilate into white society. Right? The idea was to separate people from language, culture, tradition, family, and community so that they would create themselves basically as facsimiles of white Americans in 1950s and 60s America. This produced, for many in Indian country, extraordinary levels of homophobia, and in some cases racism. But I want to deal with the homophobia, because both Randy Burns Randy Burns more so than Barbara Cameron, encountered in their respective tribal communities, their reservation communities, instances of homophobia, and like many people of their generation then, in the late 60s, early 70s, they decided, enough, I'm going to go to the city, whether it's San Francisco, whether it's Los Angeles, whether it's Chicago, whether it's Minneapolis, and I'm going to forge a new life for myself where people will embrace me for who I am. Right now, Obviously, they encountered difficulties in this pursuit because they formed these societies within these respective urban areas. In San Francisco, Cameron and Burns created the Gay American Indians, GAI. And they created that group because of the sense of social and cultural isolation that so many people continued to feel within Oakland and the Bay Area more generally, of San Francisco, Oakland, and California. What they discovered was that other gay and lesbians would not openly accept them. Indeed, they were prohibited from entering gay and lesbian clubs in San Francisco and Oakland. They faced racism. Right? So they're living their lives at this intersection of multiple discriminations and multiple prejudices in 1970s America. Right? And that's going to continue to follow them through the 1980s when a sort of a second wave of gay and lesbian Indian leaders emerges and coins or adopts the phrase Two-Spirit. But Burns and Cameron are fearless in bringing people together, in engaging in something that used to be called flash mobs or flash activism, where you'd go and you'd attend a facility or institution where you were prohibited from entering. Right? So they targeted the bathhouses and the leather houses, for example, which were insanely racist in 1950s and 60s San Francisco. They targeted the clubs, dance clubs. Right, all the while they're drawing attention to their cause and saying, hey, we're here, and we're not going away. In fact, we've been here a lot longer than you all. And they're building community. Right? So the resilience that's built through their activism and through their sense of camaraderie that emerges out of their activities in the 1970s and through the 1980s really proves foundational by the time we get to 1990 and the search for a name that will facilitate greater visibility and greater respect for Native gender and sexual fluidity. And that's where this term, we come back to this term, Liege Manitowoc. As I mentioned, there are many terms, and I provide their online resources and handbooks that you can freely download online, and I provide links to them in the book that will take you there if you're interested in exploring. But in the context of the 1990s, like this particular poster was trying to make clear, there's an element of wanting to be seen for who one was, and to be seen so that one can reach back and bring in not only to the present, but propel into the future their identity as gender fluid and sexually fluid people in the context of late 20th, early 21st century America. It is one of those tragic ironies that out of the Holocaust of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, something new was reborn. We sort of gained another glimpse of the resilience of Indigenous people. And we see it. I'm not out of time here, and I want to pause for your questions. We've seen it. This is a picture of the Bay Area Two-Spirit powwow taken just before the pandemic. I was there, got on a flight, and then the world closed. And only this past February, folks got back together in San Francisco to celebrate as they had just before the pandemic changed our lives and had us all working from home. There's so much more I could talk about, but I hope these thumbnail sketches provide you a sense of the real beauty and resilience that exists within Native communities, but particularly within Two-Spirit communities. So thank you.
Come stand next to you guys.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really, I mean, lot to take in, but I love that you ended on an inspiring note. And I want to open the room for questions, but I always like to start with something that caught my attention. And in preparing for this talk, I came across an endorsement from Chief Lynette Alston of the Nottoway Indian Tribe of Virginia. And she writes that lost teachings are found in this compelling revelation on the complexity of Two-Spirit people. Based on chronicles of native culture and historical documents, as well as oral histories and interviews, Reclaiming Two-Spirits offers an understanding of how Two-Spirit gives balance in a binary world, a reminder to everyone to have more empathy and compassion. So I think that is a really wonderful endorsement from Chief Alston, and I read other reviews that stated that you really center your narrative well in the American Indian voice, and that it's culturally sensitive and successfully brings the narrative of indigenous people into the forefront in comparison to a lot of work that focuses on the colonial aspect. But I wonder, in today's climate, this topic might be potentially polarizing. So I'm just wondering, let's think of this scenario. If you were invited to discuss your book on Good Morning America, and Michael Strahan asked you, why is this book a contribution to our understanding of early American history and culture, and why should we care about that? What would your response be to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a number of ways I can answer that. I mean, the first thing, I need to go back to Chief Lynette Alston, who, I hate the word muse because it sounds sort of cliche, but in some ways, she, since I've lived in Virginia, has become something of a muse for me because I don't want to disappoint her. And I sort of have people like Chief Lynette in the forefront of my mind when I'm writing, because I want to be sure that what I'm doing is honest and careful, and that I don't misrepresent in ways that scholars who have come before me have in some cases misrepresented Indigenous history and culture. So when I found out about that endorsement of hers, I was really touched. In terms of contribution, I mean, I think there's a lot that can be said about contribution. I mean, there's so much about Native America that is misunderstood or misrepresented, and we're in, 2023? And my hope is that books like this, that dive into this history, that revisit the written archives, as awful as they can make you feel at the end of the day, but revisit the written archives, engage with people within Indigenous communities, doing oral histories, being led by Indigenous people and their knowledge systems, and respecting the boundaries that they create for the types of knowledge that they feel comfortable putting out there for a general public, and the type of knowledge that they would prefer to keep within their communities. That, as an ethical scholar, and in my case an ethical historian, is sort of the basis, the starting point for all of my work. So I hope the book is an example, in terms of contribution, I hope the book is an example of that type of work, that engages openly and honestly and is led by Indigenous people while still retaining a sense of my own narrative voice. At the same time that we continue to recognize that there's so much that both Native and non-Native people don't know, and this book will not cover it all either. It will be, in many cases, the beginning, I hope, of a conversation about communities past and identities past and present that we don't always understand, but that we should try and empathize with. That we should try to understand how they relate to Indigenous social structures and kinship systems in the past and on their own terms, and how knowledge of that past on its own terms can inform how communities operate today in the present and then moving forward into the future. And so that requires a level of caution and empathy when you engage in this type of scholarship. which is why, as I said, I was so incredibly honored by Chief Lynette's endorsement. So I hope that would answer the question. We'll get started on a bigger answer to that type of question.
Are there any questions in the room?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering the time frame. What was there this behavior pre-colonial period by the Native American tribes?
Yeah, that's correct. So we have, as I note in the book, we have a lot of evidence from archaeology, from the handing down of oral traditions, from artwork, and even in things as seemingly not related as the architecture of people's household dwellings in the plains, indicated that there was someone special who lived there, someone with a fluid gender identity that was responsible for the care of children. The history that we're talking about here predates colonialism, but then it obviously changes, because history is about the impact of relationships, whether good or bad, and how they change what it means to have these fluid identities. And for some communities, it meant that the identity was buried so deep that it was forgotten. Not unlike the language. I mean, it's why we have so many indigenous languages that are endangered today, because of the type of dynamics that you're all probably very well aware of in North America. So this predates, and we have archaeology that we've been able to date thousands of years before Europeans arrived, and it continues, well, obviously, to this day. Yes?
So, right now we're seeing obviously a lot of bookbin happening and issues about bathrooms and protests and things like that. Are those issues on the same scale on reservations where they have more of a history of two-spirit populations? Are they generally more accepting?
It depends. It depends. I don't think we can throw a blanket sort of a set of assumptions about Indian country. It's a very diverse place, and people have all sorts of political, social, cultural beliefs and assumptions. I won't name any specific communities, but in the course of the research that I did for the book, I did find communities where people are still vehemently opposed to things like recognizing same-sex marriage within their tribal nation. I did encounter communities where the argument was and is that this was never part of our traditions, and that it was introduced to us by Europeans, right? It's a legacy of colonialism. It's the colonial minds. And this really gets into indigenous politics in a way, because tradition and then the colonized mind are words that are thrown around a lot, particularly during political campaigns in Indian country and specific indigenous communities. And so there has been and continues to be examples of that. But it is changing. It's changing. Same-sex marriage is continuing to be recognized in many tribal communities. But as many Two-Spirit elders and leaders will tell you, there's much more work to be done. It doesn't happen overnight. You've got to be in it for the long haul. Up the back, yes.
Thank you. Building off of that question, there are these social media memes, oversimplifications or glorifications of Native culture that say, well, in Native culture, gender fluid people, two-spirit people are seen as spiritual leaders. Like that's what you might see on Facebook.
Yeah.
And I wonder, it sounds like, for example, Barbara Cameron, and I forgot the name of the other.
Randy Burns
did not feel oral history, community-wide support in their struggle from their communities. In your research,
well, in some cases yes, and in other cases no. Like, so Barbara and Randy are a great example of this. So Barbara Cameron grew up really in tradition on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, and her grandparents were the ones who really did provide sort of the knowledge and the awareness both of her particularly special identity as a Two-Spirit person. But in contrast, Randy Burns had to leave to discover, or rediscover and reclaim that history. And so those different experiences are pretty emblematic of the types of different journeys that people have to go on, depending, depends on their history with colonialism and outsiders, with missionaries, a whole range of factors. So, there's no straight line, and there's no linear progress towards, well, we had this, and we lost these beautiful traditions, and we're going to beat those colonizers up, and then we're going to find it again, and everything will be great. It just doesn't exist like that. As much as some of us would like that to happen, and be the case, it's just not real life. And so they recognize that. Barbara Cameron and Randy Burns recognized that when they formed GAI, and then when the founders of the next generation of groups that ultimately settled upon Two-Spirit, they recognized it as well, that we have to be constantly talking about this, and we have to recognize that the language that we use, right, so the umbrella term Two-Spirit that provides a sense of community can't be static. Tradition is not static. It needs to be dynamic, and it needs to evolve, because that's a type of tradition that is alive, vibrant, and constantly being informed by all the different groups and generations and so on within Indigenous communities. And that was that's why I mentioned Two-Spirit as a verb rather than a noun. It's not something that's static. It's something that people are making and remaking constantly, which in some cases, to answer your question directly about the sort of straight line of oral tradition, is to fill in the silences and the gaps, both in the written and the oral traditions that have been lost over the course of 500-600 years of encounters with colonialism. Yes?
What's your understanding of the evolution of this tradition given the social context right now and the struggles by the community? Is there sort of dialogue taking place between the evolution of this tradition, and is anything informing that as we go forward?
So the evolution of this tradition, yeah, so I mean, one of the purposes in writing the book was to sort of deal with the halting nature of these very sort of active and vibrant and constantly reinterpreted traditions. And that's not easy because there's, as I mentioned just now, there's a lot of gaps in the archive, in oral traditions, and a lot of stuff that people don't feel comfortable sharing, which is something we all have to respect. What I will say, in the brief time that I have, is that there have been over the last decade or so a newer generation of Two-Spirit people coming into the movement, for want of a better word, and they're bringing a level of energy and urgency that people like Cameron and Burns had in the 70s, or that Richard LaFortune had in the 1990s around things like HIV/AIDS activism. And they're really impatient for change now. And as I get older and more curmudgeonly, I'm like, you just gotta slow down a bit and think this through, because you ain't the first to think like this. I thought like that 20 years ago. But I think that tension, as I explained in the book, that tension between the different generations is actually really productive. It doesn't have to be seen as a negative. I think it's something that is producing conversations about who the community is and how the community sees themselves and the type of visibility that people within the community want, right? So Two-Spirit as a noun is one of those conversations that's happening. There are a lot of conversations about other terminology that might be more appropriate. So younger people are embracing terms like indigiqueer. There's a lot of conversations about, well, how does the impact of You're seeing trans women in Indigenous communities, basically two-spirit people. How is that impacting our sense of well-being as communities? But also, how are we to understand that in the context of this larger history going all the way back to Balboa and his attack dogs? Right? So it's a very active engagement then with both the present and thinking about the future, but also the past. And so, unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that question. It's a messy answer. And as someone who likes mess, I'm okay with that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could speak more about your research process. It sounds like you did a reference to primary sources and that you have done oral history, but I'm curious how you do the oral history. How do you find people to get to? Just anything you can share about that.
So, I'm originally from Australia, and I came over to California in 1999. And I came from, a country that was, that had been on a course to land rights and tribal recognition, and then it sort of stopped for a variety of reasons, and that's another lecture that I'd love to talk about at some point, but not tonight. So I, at the time, decided I'm out, I'm leaving, and I'm going to get my PhD in the US instead. And I did what I was doing in Australia, right? I made connections with people in communities, how can I help? Not with any intention of actually ever going back and interviewing, but basically, long story short, I built friendships and relationships, which is how, I tell my students, that's how you build trust. You're not just in it for yourself and your academic career. In fact, that was farthest from my mind. I just enjoyed people's company who I was meeting in the Bay Area, and we hung out and we went to parties, a lot of parties sometimes. And then we talked about serious stuff too, like history and politics. And it's from that and those interactions that you then, you then fall on each other's specialties. Two-spirit people have a diversity of skills. They're lawyers, they're doctors, they're janitors, it runs the gamut. And everyone has something to bring to it, and as an outsider, I felt a serious responsibility to some of the people who were my friends and then provided me with introductions to people, to really listen and as I said, be led by those relationships. Where were the boundaries on what was acceptable to put in the public domain? And where was the boundary where if someone shared, as they did, stuff that probably shouldn't be in the public domain, how do I get that material back to them so it's secure and that they feel that the whole process was both ethical but also safe for them? So, to make a long story short then, it's about relationships, about friendships, it's about listening, and it's about something that's, I think, been lacking for a while over here in the United States. It's empathy. I often refer to it as radical empathy. I think history is really good at teaching that because you're forced to get out of your comfort zone. You're forced to get out of your space, your time frame, and get into another time frame and space and trying to understand people and places on their own terms and at different times. And that's a skill that's really, really hard for a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds. But if you stick with it, I think it then leads to the type of ethical scholarship that we've been calling for in the Academy for a while now. So I hope that addresses that.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to take 1 second to thank Virginia Humanities, Lee Enterprise, and the American Frontier Culture Foundation for supporting this lecture series. I want to thank all of you for coming out here tonight to spend this hour with us here, and everyone who's watching online, and of course, Professor Smithers, thank you very much. We appreciate you being here. Thank you for watching this talk. If you share our passion for early American history and would like to support free programs like this, please consider making a donation to the American Frontier Culture Foundation at frontierculturefoundation.org. Thank you for your support, and we hope to see you in person at the Frontier Culture Museum in Stanton, Virginia.